So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one.
One of the most common difficulties people have when it comes to Christianity is the misunderstanding of how we know we have accurate portrayals of Jesus in the original words written in the New Testament. And I hear this in some form pretty often. And this is where Christian apologist Wes Huff is in his sweet spot. And he shows it by giving Joe Rogan a very special gift that's a great visual regarding the reliability and authority of the New Testament documents. Check this out.
Yeah.
Or actually, good segue.
That's the best one, right?
So yeah, I made something for you.
Ooh.
So
What do you get? The man who has everything, right?
I make papyri facsimiles. Oh, my description is a little bit wonky here. Yeah, fix that. So you were talking about like what is our oldest manuscript evidence? So this guy is P52, John Ryland's 457. So that's a genuine Egyptian papyri that I made. I cut it out for you, and then I transcribed the text on that manuscript. So when we're talking about what is potentially our oldest evidence for the New Testament, this manuscript that most likely comes from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, is the one that usually is universally accepted as our oldest one. And that contains John 18, where Jesus is on trial before Pilate. And yeah, so that's the one. It's in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England.
So this is a copy of that exactly? This is exactly what it looks like?
Yeah, so I cut that out on the papyri with a scalpel, and then I transcribed the text on.
Oh, you did a great job, dude.
And
this is, you nerded out.
I know. I'm
for real nerded out. This is a real nerding out of.
So that's actually, yeah, so that's someone else's facsimile, which is not as good as the one I made.
It's not as good. Yours is better.
And where Jesus is on trial before Pilate, and Jesus says, everyone who follows the truth, who is following the truth, follows me. And on the back has the words of Pilate saying, what is truth? Wow. But so part of
The fact that the oldest manuscript that we have has that particular passage, I think, is just profound.
my research, so the reason I bring this up is because before this was discovered by C.H. Roberts in the 1940s, the convention was, because of a guy named C.H. Bauer, that the Gospel of John was 2nd century. And so he had this, he was a student of Hegel. Have you ever heard of Hegelian dialectic? So you have like a thesis, synthesis, and antithesis.
Yes.
So Hegel had this philosophical theory, and his student Bauer takes that and he incorporates this into history. And he says, the earliest gospel, Mark, has this very Jewish Jesus, and then the later gospels have a very the last of what are called the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke has a very kind of more divine Jesus. And so he says, based on this, John is the last written one. And it combines these two where you get a very human and a very divine Jesus together. And so based on this, he says that John has to be 2nd century. Well, we discover this guy. C.H. Roberts is, literally going through these piles of manuscripts in these drawers that are being like stashed away. And he finds this guy and he sees that it's written on both sides, which is almost exclusively a Christian convention. Because in the ancient world, they used scrolls. And the Christians, for reasons we're not entirely clear on, they start to make codices, books. And so they write on both sides. And so
Well, that's worth your admission price right there, just to know that the concept of a book originally came out of the Christian church.
he says, okay, this is written on both sides. It's probably a Christian manuscript. So he sends it off to the leading paleographers, or guys who date manuscripts. And they all say, this is the beginning of the 2nd century. And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably 2nd century, potentially the beginning of the 2nd century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus. So it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript. Wow. Which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably, and potentially even most likely into the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of these events. And so all of the literature up until that point from the scholarly consensus about the dating of the Gospel of John gets totally rewritten.
Wow.
And it's because of that guy. And because of my academic work where I was telling you in paratextual features, when we look at these tiny manuscripts and you figure out, okay, well, what does that look like on the page? I also made you. So this is, I used 2 different variations of papyri.
Whoa.
So you have there where P52 would have been on the page, and based on it's called codicological conventions, the spacings of the words, and the way that the size of the margin that we can see, where it would have been on the page and how big the page would have actually been. So this is like a reconstruction, and then I filled in the rest of the text in the same sort of stylistic hand of the scribes at that time, what that page would have looked like. So this would have come from what would have been essentially like a pocket copy of the Gospel of John.
Well, and this is very important to point out, just to kind of lock down a few ideas here, because there is so much confusion and kind of modern mythology around how the New Testament was compiled and how reliable it is and how it all works. And that visual of that codice is very important to understand, because we can at least get our dating right. That doesn't mean you have to believe the New Testament, but what I find often is that people have this basic philosophical idea that has finally made its way into pop culture, even though it goes back years, that has been kind of overturned. It's this idea that Jesus was originally, kind of in the early Gospels, he was viewed as more human, and then later in the Gospel of John, he's viewed as more divine, and all this sort of stuff. Well, first of all, if you read the Gospels without those philosophical glasses on, that's really not true. The book of Mark, which is considered the earliest of them all, you read the first chapter of Mark, and there's a lot to say that Jesus is viewed as divine, without question. So that is always present. But it's also important to understand that these documents go back, and they think that John, hopefully you heard him say this, that it went possibly back into the lifetime of the people that actually saw these events happen. That's why Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John in church history have always been viewed as the reliable, authoritative, records of Jesus' life. That's very important to know, because there were people around that were still alive that could have debunked those things instead of seeing them as later. And that and the other thing I want to lock down, when it comes to time, what I'm discovering as I get older, I say that I've been a pastor a long time, been 30 years. 30 years ago wasn't that long. The older I get, the more you realize that 30, 40 years, when people start talking about that, that's within your lifetime. And the things that are really, truly important to you, the things that you do, the things that matter, the things that impact you emotionally or intellectually, they don't go away. For one, they have an emotional lock, but for two, you keep talking about those things as if it happened yesterday. So recently, I turned 60. So one of the things that I did is I went back and I ate at a restaurant that I worked at when I was in my 20s. And it had changed a lot. It had been remodeled, but still the basic layout was still there. And I could literally remember conversations that I had in different places in that room pretty well. And those are things that I really didn't even keep track of. But if you think about people who were majorly impacted by Jesus and gave their lives to him, and it was very dramatic and all this, and they taught him, and it was he taught them, and it was their job to do these things, 20, 30, 40 years later, that's not really that much time to lose or forget these kinds of things. And understanding that from the documents and everything else is very important to do. Well, I hope that helps. And we also have done a thing that on this same kind of idea from Wes Huff in a different environment, where he was asked about the book of Enoch and why some books were chosen to be in the Bible and others weren't. Look at this, because that's another place where it's a little bit, there's a lot of misunderstanding that goes on in our modern culture. Hope that helps. See you next time.